Hello, and welcome to Project 2025, A Warning. I'm Molly Jong-Fast, a writer, a podcaster, and a person you occasionally see on cable news. Today, I'm talking to Thomas Zimmer, a historian at Georgetown University and author of the newsletter Democracy Americana, who's done some of the most thorough writing there is on the implications of Project 2025. But before we start that conversation, let's get you up to speed. Last year, the influential right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, unveiled Project 2025. It is a roadmap for what another Trump administration would look like. It instructs independent agencies or agencies that would have been independent under other administrations, such as the Department of Justice, to be placed under direct presidential control. This basically gives the president a lot more power than a president has ever had before. And I know right now you may be thinking that this sounds a little crazy, like something one of your friends who reads a little too much Facebook sends you. But the Heritage Foundation developed and then linked the Project 2025 mission statement right from their website. The plan is titled Mandate for Leadership 2025, the Conservative Promise. They are not trying to hide it. In fact, they go on television and brag about it. And what they brag about is a plan to reshape America into the craziest conservative dystopia possible. Some of their plans include ending the Affordable Care Act, additional tax breaks for corporations and the 1%, cuts to Social Security, the end of climate protections, cutting Medicare, defunding the FBI and Homeland Security, banning sexual orientation and gender identity education, strictly limiting contraceptives and regulating in vitro fertilization, banning pornography and imprisoning anyone who disobeys, elimination of union and worker protections, raising the retirement age, raising prescription drug prices, eliminating the Department of Education, banning African American and gender studies at all levels of education, banning books and curriculum about slavery, use of the military to break up domestic protests, ending birthright citizenship, eliminating federal agencies like the FDA, EPA, and NOAA. And despite how crazy that sounds, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Now, you may be thinking, the Heritage Foundation isn't Donald Trump. It isn't his presidential campaign or the Republican Party. But the Heritage Foundation has been the laboratory for many of the conservative policies of the last half century. But don't take my word for it. Here's Senator Marco Rubio from the state of Florida.
And it's good to see you, and thank you to Heritage for inviting us here, giving us this opportunity, and for all the scholarship that they do here that really serves as a guidepost for a lot of the public policy we choose to make.
These policies are wildly unpopular, and Trump has tried to cover up his ties to them, namely Russ Vought and John McEntee. Let's discuss these guys. Christian nationalist Russ Vought, an author of Project 2025, serves as the policy director of the Republican Party Platform Writing Committee for the RNC. You know, the organization that Trump's daughter-in-law runs that pays many of his legal fees. And you may remember right-wing dating app entrepreneur John McEntee, who was Trump's body man and nicknamed Deputy President, joined Project 2025 to write the database for who the Trump administration should hire. And Trump's own insiders say he will be a big part of the next Trump administration. But a clear sign of Trump's tether to Project 2025 is that Trump's name appears in the document 312 times. They are indeed one in the same. And if you don't take this seriously, here's Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, and he's going to show you just how serious they are.
We are going to win. We're in the process of taking this country back. No one in the audience should be despairing. No one should be discouraged. We ought to be really encouraged by what happened yesterday. And in spite of all of the injustice, which of course friends and audience of this show, of our friend Steve know, we are going to prevail.
Well, that sounds threatening.
We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
I'm starting to think that these people may actually be very serious about making this happen. Kevin Roberts also said that he saw Heritage's role as institutionalizing Trumpism, adding that the Trump administration, with the best of intentions, simply got off to a slow start. Heritage and its allies in Project 2025 believe that that slow start should never be repeated. So, now that we've established that Project 2025 is the plan that Trump will use to reshape America, and that it will be even more insane than his first administration, let's bring in the brilliant Georgetown historian Thomas Zimmer, to give us some more of the details on Project 2025. Welcome, Thomas, to this Project 2025 YouTube series. The reason that I decided that it was so important we do this was because of the interview I did with you. Some people may not know what Project 2025 is. So can you just give us a sort of very nuts and bolts explanation of what it is?
Yes. So Project 2025 is the name of a massive planning operation on the right. It's spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation. It was launched about 2 years ago in the spring of 2022, and it has brought together much of the right-wing machinery of think tanks and lobbying groups and political institutions with the goal of making sure that the next Republican presidency would be a much more effective, much more ruthless right-wing regime. I think it's best to understand Project 2025 as the American right's declaration of war on the idea of a multiracial, pluralistic, diverse society. Project 2025 is a plan to execute what amounts to a comprehensive authoritarian takeover of American government and transform government into a machine that serves only two purposes. First, exacting revenge on what they call the woke, leftist, globalist enemy, and secondly, imposing a minoritarian, reactionary vision of white Christian patriarchal order on society. So that's sort of the very, very big picture understanding, I think, of what Project 2025 is.
Can we talk a little bit now about the sort of like day-to-day implications of what America under Project 2025 would look like? For example, a lot of things during the first Trump administration that he tried to do, he wasn't able to do. The Muslim ban, wanting to shut down the border, it's stuff that, like his sort of big dreams, deportation squads. What would it look like now? Like, what things do you think he could realistically get going right away?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to sort of understand that the diagnosis from which they start, from which all of these planning efforts on the right start, is that they see the first Trump administration as a failure. Like, they are very clear that they weren't ready. Trump world wasn't ready in 2017. They had no plans. They had no personnel to implement whatever plans they didn't have. And they had very little understanding of the vast and powerful machine that is the American government. And again, no one understands this better than they do. And they think that they were, because they didn't have personnel, they had to rely on these people, like normal lawyers and bureaucrats and like normal people, right? And they think these people sabotage them. And so this time, again, they feel like we're going to have plans. We're going to purge the American government from all these people who sabotaged us in the first time around. We're going to replace them with an army of thousands of loyalists and ideological conformists who they are actively looking for. That is part of Project 2025. The policy agenda is only one part of Project 2025. The overall planning operation goes far beyond that. They're looking for thousands of people that they can put into government, into these positions. What would that amount to? I mean, look, the first thing it would amount to is a vastly worse government.
Because a lot of these people these are government jobs. They're not partisan. And so you're removing people like from the EPA, which they hate the EPA, but you still want to make sure water doesn't have lead in it, right? I mean, there are certain small things that will be fucked up that we can't even sort of quantify, right?
Yes. I think, again, this is probably the point to maybe talk about how extreme the vision of sort of a purge is that they want to institute here, right? They want to come in and look, there's about 4,000 political appointees in American government, right? And every administration, when they come in, they look at all these political appointments. These are people sort of at the higher end of all these departments and agencies. And every administration looks at them, and every administration replaces, the number fluctuates, but usually about 1,000 people or so, right? So every administration brings in about 1,000 people. But other than that, they let these normal people, bureaucrats, civil servants, they let them do their job, because that's the whole point about the civil service is you have people who are insulated from direct political control, and they are experts, they know their jobs, they do their jobs, right? So sort of untouched by, there's a new administration, we're going to replace the whole personnel. Now, Project 2025 wants to do something entirely different. They want to come in and convert tens of thousands of career civil service positions into political appointments, starting with anyone, they say, in sort of a policy adjacent position or a policy advisory role, but these terms really don't mean anything. The goal is to strip all these people of their civil service protections in order to make them fireable and then fire them. Because again, if you have civil service protection, you can't just be fired for no reason. But they want to convert them into political appointments, fire them, and then replace them with an army of loyalists and ideological conformists. They're talking about numbers, again, fluctuate, but something like 50,000 people that they want to come in, fire, replace by their own people. But think about who they want to bring in here. These would be people whose sole qualification is that they are ideologically on board with the Trumpist project. These wouldn't be experts, right? These wouldn't be people with many years, even decades of experience in these, again, highly specialized, highly technical jobs. These would just be ideological conformists. And again, this would make government so much worse. It would make government vastly less functional, right? Even beyond just the fact that it would turn government into sort of this authoritarian revenge machine, it would just function worse, right? Because you have people who just have no idea what they're doing.
How government works. Can you explain the 4 pillars?
Yes. That is their own terminology, the 4 pillars. So in their own words, Project 2025 consists of 4 pillars. One is the policy agenda. That is spelled out in this, again, 900 or so page report they have published. It is titled Mandate for Leadership, a Conservative Promise. That's one of the 4 pillars. Second one is a personnel database intended to build an army of loyalists. That's the second pillar. Third one is what they call a training effort that currently consists of like online courses. They call it the Presidential Administration Academy. So basically to get these loyalists who they find and all the sort of political appointees ready to implement the right-wing agenda. That's the third part. And then finally, the 4th pillar, Project 2025 vows to create what they call a playbook of actions to be taken in the first 180 days of the new administration to, quote, bring quick relief to Americans suffering from the left's devastating policies. That's the 4th pillar. Now, this 4th pillar, this playbook, this sort of emergency playbook for the first 6 months in power, at this point is still distinctly vague, and it seems to exist only in the form of sort of an announcement of future action. So that has not been published yet. They're working on this. That's not out yet. But these are the 4 pillars. So that's, again, the policy agenda. That's a 900-page report is only one part of this much broader planning operation.
Can you, for 2 seconds, explain sort of this first 180 days plan?
I mean, again, we don't know what that will be in substance, right?
Right.
There's been some interesting reporting in like the last few days about this guy, Russell Vaught, who supposedly is intimately involved in drafting this, maybe even the head of that operation of this sort of 180-day playbook. Again, they're keeping this under wraps. We don't know, but it speaks to this broader sense of urgency that they feel, right? The sense that we don't have much time left. That's sort of throughout this 900-page policy report. It's stressed everywhere. We don't have much time left. This is our last chance. We need to act immediately. We need to act swiftly and decisively. And so that's why, in addition to outlining their overall policy agenda in this sort of 900-page report, they want to flank that by, and also, here is what we're going to do immediately. And that probably means through executive orders, presidential executive orders, emergency measures. I mean, honestly, who knows at this point? Because clearly, they do not feel constrained by norms or precedent. Clearly, one of the big regrets that they have, and I mean they, meaning Trump himself, but also the people behind Project 2025, is that they didn't invoke the Insurrection Act in the summer of 2020 to go into these blue cities and oppress the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Very clearly and very openly, they say that was a mistake. That was a mistake because we were listening to these lawyers in and around the White House who had sort of qualms about legality and precedent and norm and all that good stuff. And they think that was a big mistake. That's what Trump means when he says There was a big Time magazine piece where they had some long interviews with Trump, and it started with a Trump quote saying, "I was too nice the first time around." That's exactly how these Project 2025 people also feel. We were too nice. We were listening to these people who said to us, you should not invoke the Insurrection Act, which would have allowed them to send federal troops into like Washington, D.C. to oppress protests. And so when they say 180-day playbook, like emergency measures, like that's the stuff that's on the table here, right? Like, how about we invoke the Insurrection Act to quote unquote restore order, which means oppressing protests.
It's so incredibly scary and insane. If you want to weigh in on this, Steve Bannon, on Trump's Project 2025, we mock your fear. We want you to fear. There will be accountability. We are going to hold everyone who opposes Trump responsible. This will come with authority, the authority of Donald Trump.
This is actually interesting. So Steve Bannon is not Project 2025, right? So he's not involved directly in this project, nor is Trump, right? So it's really important to understand there are different factions on the right, Trump and Trump campaign being one of them, but there are others, and they're all involved in some kind of planning operation. And Project 2025 is one of those. It stands out because it has sort of united so much of the right-wing machinery, but there are different factions. What is interesting about sort of these other parts, Trump himself or Bannon, sort of referring to Project 2025 is that I think it would be a really big misunderstanding to look at this and say, oh, it's not Trump, and Trump doesn't care about these big plans, and like, okay, they can put out like 1,000-page policy report. Who cares? Trump's not going to read it. I think that would be a big misunderstanding. These people who are involved in Project 2025, they are well connected to other parts of the right. They are well connected to the right wing, even the most extremist fringe, some of the key actors behind Project 2025. Again, they are closely connected to Bannon. They go on Bannon's podcast. They talk to him, but they're also closely connected to the inner circle around Trump. Partly they're even officially part of Trump campaign efforts. So these are all connected efforts. They're not all the same, and there are even rivalries between these different factions. They don't all like each other. You know, they will, in case Trump were to win the election, I'm sure they would be sort of fighting over influence and power. You know, that's just how that stuff goes. But again, this is deeply and intimately connected to all parts of the right. And the most important thing is they really fundamentally agree on the broad outlines of what they want to do with power. So even if you want to say, oh, this isn't exactly the right thing that the Trump campaign is putting out there, in broad strokes, they are very much in agreement about what they want to do with power if they get back to the White House.
Yeah. So that, I think, is really important. Not everyone is from the same organization, right? Like Steve Bannon is not related to the Heritage Foundation, is not. But all of their needs and desires align completely. Yeah,
I mean, look, the one thing they can all agree on, regardless of how much they may despise each other on like a personal level, and you know, these people, they're all pretty odious, honestly, so they don't like each other necessarily. But you know, the one thing they can all agree on is, first of all, they hate the left more, regardless of how much and by left, they really mean like any attempt at leveling sort of discriminatory hierarchies of race, gender, religion, and wealth, right? That's what they call the left. So this is not like a narrow sense of the American left and like something that maybe you and I would call the left. Broadly, it's like any attempt to make this into anything but a society that is defined by white Christian patriarchal domination. That's the left, and they despise it, and they think it has they are convinced that they are under siege by this leftist egalitarian project. They are convinced that the quote-unquote left has basically managed to overtake all institutions of American life, including the American government. They really believe this, by the way. They really believe in these sort of conspiratorial ideas of a vast leftist, communist, socialist, woke, it doesn't matter. They just use these terms interchangeably. For them, again, anything that levels discriminatory hierarchies is just left, socialist, communist, woke, doesn't matter. And they really believe there's this vast conspiracy that has taken over all institutions of American life. And so they're all convinced. And when I say all, I mean all these different factions on the right, they are convinced that sort of quote unquote normal conservatism is just not enough to sort of save their understanding of quote unquote real America. And so they lust for this sort of more radical politics and what they now openly and sort of aggressively refer to as a counter-revolution. And that's how they define their project, as sort of a counter-revolutionary project against the supposed leftist takeover of America.
So part of this authoritarian thing where the left is so dangerous that we have to do extraordinary things to, right? Like this is this sort of weird way of thinking, this sort of Reichstag fire, right? It's an authoritarian trope, right?
It's probably the key thing to understand about the American right today is sort of the permission structure that governs conservative politics. We should really be asking ourselves, how are they giving themselves permission to go along with Trump, go along with, like, again, in 2016, a lot of these people who are now all in on this sort of Trumpian project, who are deeply engaged in these planning operations, they said they didn't like Trump. They said they despised Trump. They initially even pretended to oppose Trump before falling quickly in line. So the question is, how are they giving themselves permission to go along with this? And how are they giving themselves permission to openly renounce supposed pillars of conservatism like small government and all that stuff, that they insisted we accept as sort of the defining features of conservatism as a political project. And now they are, even rhetorically, openly, aggressively throwing all that overboard and are basically saying, no, we need to weaponize the state. We need to weaponize government, mobilize the coercive powers of government against our enemies. And they're giving themselves permission by basically saying, look, the left has already gone much further. Everything we do is only in reaction to a radicalized leftist, woke, globalist, whatever enemy that has already started its revolutionary assault on America, that has already started its violent assault on America, right? That's why every time you mention something about, hey, the right is really sort of openly endorsing vigilante violence, you get this sort of flood of people telling you that, oh, where were you in the summer of 2020 when these leftist barbarians burned down Portland? Like this is an accepted dogma on the right, that the left is already engaged in this kind of project and that they are basically not only justified in responding with this kind of radicalized politics, but that it is deeply necessary to do that.
That's the thinking, is that this is extraordinary measures, but these extraordinary measures are in fact prompted, right?
That is precisely right. They truly believe that they are sort of under siege. They see themselves, all of these people, and you see this when you read Project 2025. If you even just read, they put out this 900-page policy report, and I'm not expecting anyone to read the whole thing. I mean, I did, but, it's not fun. But there's a foreword that was written by the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. It's only about 15, 16 pages long. And I would really like to have everyone read this, just the foreword, because he is so clear about this idea that he says, look, we are under siege, right? We are the noble defenders of real America, real sort of white Christian patriarchal America. And we are the defenders of this noble enterprise. We are under siege from these leftist, globalist forces. And the only thing we're going to be able to save America, the only version of America that they are willing to accept is by, again, no more talk about small government, no more restraint, no more compromise. It's sort of a radical, openly, aggressively, explicitly radical politics is now a counter-revolution, is now what is needed. And he, honestly, he could not be clearer, right? If someone thinks, hey, not sure if I want to believe this sort of, lefty liberal professor, just read what they are saying. They could not possibly be clearer about what it is that is animating them.
Hi, I just want to stop for 1 second. The reason we put this on YouTube for free is because we want you to know what a second Trump term will look like. It would really help us if you comment, click like, and send this to a friend or 3. Thank you so much. Back to the interview. Some of the highlights in this report are they talk about Roberts praises Viktor Orban, his regime in Hungary, advocates for destroying the administrative state and firing federal employees. Explain to us why that's so important.
There's 3 sort of different important things that you said there, right? So the first thing is this explicit love for right now it is Viktor Orban specifically. I mean, find yourself someone in life who loves you half as much as the American right loves Viktor Orban. There's a long tradition of the American right sort of looking to foreign authoritarian leaders and admiring them. This honestly starts in the early 20th century with the German emperor and goes all the way to Francisco Franco in Spain, which, I mean, they just adored and loved as kind of like, this is the kind of Catholic Christian kind of society that we want. Right now it's Orban. And what they see in Orban is just, again, someone who supposedly has managed to stem the tide of leftist liberalism. And sort of Orban himself presents himself explicitly as an illiberal democracy, is what he calls Hungary, right? And the idea is just, oh, this is some kind of white Christian patriarchal wonderland where men still get to be men, and all these enemies, the enemy within, all the gay people and all the trans people, and they understand their place, which is they need to be quiet and don't expect like equality and all that stuff. That's what the American right sees in Hungary, and that's what they want to transplant to over here. And again, what Project 2025 suggests is the way to do that is to, well, here's the second thing you said, right? Dismantle the administrative state. That's only one half of this project. It's really important to not fall for sort of the small government rhetoric.
Right, that's bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately, look, they want to dismantle some parts of government, some parts of the state. They want to rob government of any tool that could be used to create a fairer, more sort of egalitarian society. That needs to go. That's out. That's the dismantling part. But then there is a weaponizing part, a mobilizing part that has nothing to do with dismantling. And that goes to, again, with a laser focus in this report, again, over 900 pages, they go through all the departments, all these federal agencies, many of which I'm fairly certain most people have probably not a clear understanding of what those actually do. But these people, they understand government as a machine. They understand what these departments do. And with a laser focus, they tell you, okay, here is something that we want to dismantle because it could be used as a tool to create a fairer society. But here is something we're going to mobilize and weaponize because that we can use as our tool to impose our vision of society on America. So it's really important to keep both of those things in mind, right? It's not a project to dismantle the state. It is dismantling some parts and weaponizing, mobilizing others.
Right. And I think that's a really, really good point. And when you think about birth control or IVF, this Project 2025 has really extensive writing about IVF. Can you talk about that and how that fits into this dismantling of the administrative state?
In general, the Department of Health and Human Services is an excellent example for how this is really about weaponizing the state and not actually dismantling. They say upfront they want to turn the Department of Health and Human Services into what they call the Department of Life. And of course, they mean sort of white Christian patriarchal life. Specifically with abortion, right? What that means is they're very clear about basically instituting a total abortion ban through the back door, right? So they're saying, this is a direct quote, HHS, that's again the Department of Health and Human Services, should return to being known as the Department of Life by explicitly rejecting the notion that abortion is healthcare. So no more of this kind of, woke liberal abortion as healthcare stuff. That's out, right? Instead, right, they want to ban medical abortions. They want to ban what they call mail order abortions. They want to outlaw mifepristone. The FDA wouldn't approve abortion medication anymore. They would outlaw the shipping of abortion medication via the Comstock Act. And then they want to, and this is really something that I think is quite remarkable, they want to supercharge abortion surveillance via the CDC. So the CDC as part of that sort of Department of Health and Human Services sort of infrastructure. On the one hand, they hate the CDC because of COVID, right? Like the CDC, that was COVID restrictions, and obviously they hate that. But then they understand that they can use the CDC as part of the larger crusade against what they call abortion tourism. So these are direct quotes from the policy report. Again, the problem, according to Project 2025, is that, quote, liberal states have now become sanctuaries for abortion tourism. So what they want to do with the CDC is They want to collect abortion data from the entire country in one place in the CDC. They want to force blue states to comply with this, turn over that information, which, for instance, right now, California, for instance, does not, right? California does not give that information to the federal government. And they want to use, and this is another quote, HHS should use every available tool, including the cutting of funds, to ensure that every state reports exactly how many abortions take place within its borders, at what gestational age of the child, for what reason, the mother's state of residence, and by what method. So what they're envisioning here is a unified data bank with comprehensive data on every abortion in America in the hands of a patriarchal regime lusting for control over the bodies of women. So again, this has nothing to do with small government, right? This is an authoritarian vision of how you can use government to impose your understanding. In this case, basically a total abortion ban, even if they don't get legislation to that effect, which they understand that they might not get a legislative abortion ban, so they have other ways to do it.
One of the things I'm hoping you could just talk for a second about, when you listen to the oral arguments for the mifepristone case, you hear Thomas and Alito talking about this act, and they say the number, they don't say the name of it. Explain to us sort of how the right has gotten involved in the Comstock Act. We know that Anthony Comstock was a sort of anti-sin evangelist of the 1800s. His goal was to keep women from being polluted by mail with things that might, make them have sex, or be, pornography is involved in this too. Can you make it make sense how this has come back, this act?
This is a law that's on the book, and it basically outlaws the mailing or shipping of quote-unquote obscene materials. That's what it does. And so they want to use it and basically define these abortion medications, right? And everything to do with abortion as obscene material, and thereby sort of outlaw the mailing and shipping of these medications and materials. So again, even if you don't have a national legislative abortion ban in the country, I think it's probably important to know, about 2/3 of abortions in the United States use medication, right? And specifically mifepristone. And so if you outlaw the mailing and shipping of that medication, then people just won't get it. Also, like hospitals and doctors won't have it, right? And so again, in that case, even if you don't get a national abortion ban through Congress, you have basically vastly curtailed the accessibility of how, the majority of abortions in this country take place.
Can I ask you, one of the things that I am struck by, perhaps because I might be on this list, is the revenge stuff. Weaponize the government against enemies, so-called enemies of the state. That would be you and I, right?
Here's maybe where we can sort of differentiate between Project 2025 in a narrow sense, which is about government more sort of narrowly defined, and then sort of the Trump project more broadly, right? Project 2025 is specifically about government employees, civil servants. So there's, and then of course, the question is, once they have replaced all these people with their own loyalists, what happens then? But this isn't like, so I work as a private university as a professor, so I'm not on the radar for Project 2025 in a narrow sense. But what is true, of course, is that, it's entirely animated by this idea that you have to turn government into a revenge machine, right? It's explicitly, and by the way, you saw this in the right-wing reactions to the Trump verdicts, even from people who supposedly, again, have been telling us for years that they don't like Trump very much, but they hate the left more. It's entirely about, the left is weaponizing the justice system, right? The left is weaponizing the state. So what can we do other than, once we get back to power, do the same thing? So there's an enormous amount of projection going on here, but it's also this permission structure where they say, look, the left has already, quote unquote, politicized the Department of Justice or the justice system more generally. So when we get back to power, of course we're going to do that, right? Of course we're going to politicize the Department of Justice. Of course we're going to use the Department of Justice to go after our enemies. And Trump may be slightly more explicit about this when he says, clearly, we're going to go after Joe Biden and we're going to go after all my enemies. But Project 2025 is also abundantly clear There's not going to be anything like an autonomous Department of Justice, right? No more autonomy. The Department of Justice will function as a tool to enact the regime's agenda, and they are very explicit about that.
And also probably this is like one of the things you see in authoritarian countries, like the IRS goes after Trump's enemies.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, like once you have the people in position in these commissions, departments, agencies, right, who are on board with your project, there's no one left to say, hey, this doesn't seem right. This is not how we usually operate. We're not supposed to do this. That's explicitly what happened in the first Trump administration. There was a lot of that going on, right? There was a lot of just people, quote unquote, bureaucrats, civil servants saying, wait, this is not okay. I'm not on board with this. I'm just going to keep doing my job, right? And so again, because they weren't ready in 2017 and they didn't have their own people, and they also they didn't understand how government worked. This is a very complicated machine, but that has completely flipped. Like if you read this report, one thing you can't say is these are not dummies, right? These are not dumb people. This time they understand government. They have a precise understanding of how this machine works, but that also means they have a precise understanding of like what parts of the machine they can use to their own ends. So we're looking at a completely different ballgame compared to 2017.
Can you just like sort of sketch out the worst case scenario for us?
It's an interesting question to think about. What's actually going to happen in like January 2025 and onwards, right? So if Trump were to win the election, win the electoral college, back to power, I don't think the right way to think about this is to say they will be able to implement all of these plans exactly the way they've outlined them. That's just not how the world works, right? That's not how that works. But I think the key takeaway for me from, again, trying to grasp sort of what's happening here is that if they were to win the 2024 election, they would be much better prepared than the last time. And also they would operate under conditions that are vastly more favorable to their cause. And I think that's really important. So, I mean, I think there's at least three sort of broader context factors that make the conditions more favorable to them. First of all, the next right-wing regime could count on a game-changing reactionary supermajority on the Supreme Court. That was just not the case during Trump's first presidency. Let's remember that, right? That is a big deal. Second thing is, this would be a very different right of a very different Republican Party from the one that came to power in 2017. And by the way, that starts with Trump himself. The idea that he has always been the same, just Trump being Trump, is massively misleading. It obscures the drastic radicalization of him as sort of the right's undisputed leader. And beyond Trump, I mean, the right's significant radicalization has found its manifestation in an almost fully Trumpified GOP, right? So even people like, I don't know if people even remember them. Do you remember Mitt Romney? I mean, I know you do, but like Liz Cheney, people who drew the line somewhere, right? They drew the line at violent insurrection against the government. That's where they drew the line. These people are out. They have been ostracized from the Republican Party, right? This is not the same Republican Party as the one I'm not saying the Republican Party in 2017 was like a moderate political force. That's not what I'm saying. But still, this is a difference of fully Trumpified GOP. And finally, I think resistance to the right-wing regime, and not just coming from the left, but also from whatever skepticism still remains among Republicans, would face a level of violent threat far beyond anything the country experienced during the first Trump presidency, right? Like again, these threats of violence, they have reached a completely different level. Threats of violence against federal officials, threats of violence against federal judges, threats of violence against election officials. Like every election official in the country knows if they certify a Biden election victory, like they will be getting these massive, serious violent threats from Trump world, from MAGA world, from the right-wing base. The general acceptance of political violence amongst people on the right has drastically risen over the past few years. More and more people are explicitly saying that they think political violence against the enemy is not only justified but necessary. This is a different environment from like 2017. And I think Americans may want to push back. Like, again, the majority of Americans is not on board with any of this, right? The clear majority, like numerical majority of Americans rejects all this stuff. But I think it would be far harder and far more dangerous this time to push back because of, again, the kind of the rise of violent threat that we have been experiencing. So I think if you take all this together, this is a completely different environment. It's just not the same. It's just not the same game as 2017.
It would be Russia, right?
It's not Russia, right? So I think we would be a little too casual Russia is really, really bad, right? There's no independent media institutions in Russia left, right? People get assassinated Putin, openly assassinates his enemies. Think of this as not a black and white, functioning democracy versus Russia. Think of it as a sort of a sliding scale of gray towards darker. And I think the key thing to understand is that we as a country, America as a country, is significantly further down the road towards that dark place than we were 6, 7, 8, whatever years ago. That's sort of the thing to grapple with here, right? And that's also sort of the thing to grapple with as we're coming up on an election, because the question at some point becomes, how long can you still sort of halt that trajectory towards authoritarianism through just elections, right? That's the question that sort of America is faced with. And at what point are elections just not going to be enough? That's the situation in a place like Hungary and clearly Russia, where they still have elections, right? Everyone still has elections. It's almost impossible to sort of change the trajectory of the country back towards a more democratic, liberal kind of society. And that is sort of the trajectory that we're on. Again, if Trump were to win the election, if he's defeated, different ballgame, right? Although I think in that case, the absolute worst takeaway or assumption would be that, things would just go back to quote unquote normal. And I don't know, Republicans would just see the light and return to the Democratic
Because we've now
fold.
seen that that's not happening.
No. In fact, I think quite the opposite. Again, this whole operation is so fueled and animated by this sense of being under siege, right? By quote unquote real America being under siege by these quote unquote un-American leftist forces, and losing elections is only fueling that sense. That's exactly what happened after 2020. We've seen a significant radicalization after the 2020 election on the right. And I'm not talking about people who claim Trump won the election. That's one subset of people, right? Who are like, no, Trump actually won the election. The radicalization is among people who openly sort of accept the fact that a clear majority of Americans voted against Trump and the Republican Party, because they see that as proof how far these leftist un-American forces have already captured American society, right? And so they think that's precisely the reason why they need to radicalize, why conservatism is no longer enough, and why the Republican Party has completely given up on trying to mobilize a majority, a conservative majority. That is a new thing, right? That's not, again, think back to after Mitt Romney's defeat in 2012, they had this whole autopsy thing, right? Where explicitly the message amongst the Republican establishment was, we need to have a better outreach. We need to outreach to minorities. We can't just do like white people. We need to have a broader appeal if we want to mobilize majorities. They have completely given up on this idea, completely given up, completely accepted the fact that they are in the minority and that only ever more authoritarian measures can keep them in power. That's precisely sort of the big shift that has happened here.
So interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that we can't have a more upbeat, more...
Thank you so much for watching this episode. We made this series so you can educate others in your life about the threat to American democracy that Trump's second term would be and what Project 2025 promises. So please share this with friends. Click like on the video and comment so it spreads to more people on YouTube. Thanks for watching.